In today's story, we're going back to the year 1992. That year, the Toronto Blue Jays defeated the Atlanta Braves 4-2, winning their first World Series title and becoming the first Canadian team to win the World Series. On April 5th, the Iranian embassy in Ottawa was stormed by members of MEK, an Iraq-supported religious right group. And on May 9th, 26 miners were killed in the West Ray mining disaster in Plymouth, Nova Scotia. During the spring of 1992, the murders of a quiet couple at their country home in rural Ontario shocked the country. Ian and Nancy Blackburn were found stuffed into the trunk of Nancy's car outside their home in Toronto. And the suspect, who was eventually identified as David Alexander Snow, had also been breaking into properties in the Caledon area throughout the winter, leaving strange calling cards behind that were dangerously escalating. Before Ontario Provincial Police could capture Snow, he fled to Vancouver, British Columbia, where he went on a 2-week violent crime spree of kidnapping, sexual assault, and robbery before being apprehended by North Vancouver RCMP on July 12, 1992. This is the story of the Cottage killer, David Snow. Welcome to Orangeville, Ontario, with a population today of more than 29,000 people. Much of this growth is a result of the town becoming a bedroom community to those who work in the Greater Toronto Area. The town is about 60 kilometers northwest of Toronto, and back in the 1990s, much smaller in population, sitting at about 19,000 people. The Orangeville-Caledon area has many cottages that for most of the year are left vacant. These homes have become easy targets for robberies. People sometimes arrive in the springtime to find that they've been broken into. In the early 1990s, what began as multiple break-and-enters in the Caledon area evolved into something much more sinister. For more than 25 years, Ian and Nancy Blackburn used their farm in Caledon as a weekend retreat away from the city. Ian was a partner in a real estate firm, and Nancy was a public health nurse. On Tuesday, April 7, 1992, Ian Blackburn, age 54, drove up to spend the day at the farm. Ian wasn't seen by anyone in the area, but his car was seen by his sister and brother-in-law who had the property next door, and a patrolling OPP officer. When Nancy arrived home from work later that day, she was surprised that Ian wasn't home yet. And within a few hours, Nancy seemed to have disappeared as well. Friends became concerned when the Blackburns failed to show up at a maple sugar party they were supposed to be hosting in Caledon Sunday evening. Police would later find out that a 3-minute phone call was made at 7:36 p.m. that night, from the Blackburns' farmhouse in Caledon to their Toronto home. And the following week, neither of the Blackburns showed up for work. After a week of not hearing from the Blackburns, Orville Osborne, their brother-in-law, was concerned. The Blackburns were supposed to visit Orville and his wife while in Caledon, but they didn't show up or phone, which was unlike them. And Ian's maroon Cadillac was parked in the driveway at the farmhouse. So Orville called his son Jamie, who lived in Toronto, and asked him to visit the Blackburns' house in the city. His son reported that Nancy Blackburn's car was parked in the driveway, and it looked like no one was home. 4 days' worth of newspapers were sitting on the doorstep. Jamie looked through the window of Nancy's car and saw what looked like a tissue covered in blood. And then Orville asked his son to look in the trunk, to which Jamie responded, quote, "We found Nancy and Ian." The couple had been bound, hog-tied, and beaten. Nancy Blackburn had also been sexually assaulted and had red marks all over her shoulder and back. And pathologist testimony years later at trial said that pooling of blood in the body indicated that Ian was dead on his back before he was placed in the trunk. He also had ligature marks on his right wrist and across his mid-thighs. And there were 6 round bruises on his head, consistent with being struck repeatedly by a round, firm edge. Homicide investigators from the Ontario Provincial Police joined the Toronto Police Department as they tried to determine whether the Blackburns were killed at their farmhouse in Caledon or at their home in Toronto. Both Blackburns had marks around their throat and mouth, and an autopsy would later show that Nancy had been strangled. The bloody tissue in the front seat of Nancy's car was collected into evidence. But other than the tissue, the Toronto home didn't appear to be the crime scene. There was no other evidence of a violent attack. The police searched the Blackburn home in Toronto, but everything appeared to be in order. However, when they searched the basement, police found something strange. There were items missing from a storage cupboard where photographs and slides and a projector were stored. In the meantime, the Ontario Provincial Police searched the farmhouse in Caledon. It was discovered that the assailant broke into the house through a window. There were small marks found around the window that looked as if a screwdriver was used to pry it open. However, according to the forensics team, the crime scene looked very clean. It didn't appear that a struggle took place. But after using auxiliary lighting, police noticed small areas of staining. These stains would test positive as human blood, belonging to Nancy Blackburn. However, blood found on the tissue in the front of Nancy's car in Toronto belonged to neither of the victims. After gathering forensic evidence, including phone records from the night the couple went missing, police began to piece together what possibly occurred that day. It was obvious that when Ian arrived at the farmhouse, he was confronted and assaulted. He was forced to call Nancy back in Toronto to make sure that she would come out to the farmhouse. And police believed that Nancy was immediately attacked and killed at the cottage, and that Mr. Blackburn was forced at gunpoint to drive back to Toronto and killed there, and placed in the trunk of the vehicle with his wife. An autopsy showed that Nancy Blackburn died of ligature strangulation, and Ian Blackburn died of asphyxiation. In the days following the horrific discovery, police interviewed friends and family of the couple, looking for potential suspects, but all were quickly eliminated. But as the police began to search the area close to the crime scene, they discovered new unusual evidence. They found garbage bags in nearby ditches. Inside the bags were food wrappers and a section of the newspaper missing from the Blackburn farmhouse. The bags also contained human excrement rolled in newspapers and juice bottles filled with urine. Making this investigation even more confusing, there was an assortment of military writings organized into lists. But these writings didn't seem to make any sense to the police who were looking at them. In the beginning, police believed that they were dealing with an isolated case. But after further investigation, police learned that similar writings had been found in other break-and-enters in the area. There were break-ins in at least 3 other Caledon area cottages that winter, where the same weird evidence was left behind. The writings, the urine bottles, the shit wrapped in newspapers, even the food the offender was eating in the cottages was similar. Because of his habit of camping out in cottages for weeks on end, the intruder was nicknamed the House Hermit by local police. The previous winter, Barry Barnett was taking a walk with his wife and some friends around Green Lake when he decided to check on a friend's cottage. The owner, Brian Sherman, was in Toronto at the time. Except for the 17 people who owned the land around the lake, very few knew that there were cottages in the bush along the shore. They entered the home to find a pot of soup simmering on the stove, and the place was a mess. Suddenly, a shaggy-looking man popped around the corner holding a large gun. However, one of the women managed to escape to the nearest telephone and call the police. He didn't say anything, but he made the remaining 3 people sit on the couch for about 10 minutes while he gathered up his stuff and fled the scene. Fortunately, in this case, nobody was hurt, but the brush with the intruder left the community badly shaken. This intruder had left handwritten lists of battleships, aircrafts, and other World War II weapons in multiple Caledon homes and cottages he had broken into over the past few months. Police were starting to suspect that this man might be playing a war game while he was hiding in some of these cottages. They were dealing with a person who was very methodical, who was skilled at breaking into houses and who was very careful to not leave fingerprints at the scene. Police immediately issued a warning to residents in remote areas and those who were about to open their cottages. But on several occasions, returning homeowners surprised the house hermit, and one incident occurred just 3 weeks before the Blackburns were murdered. On March 18, 1992, the house hermit was squatting in the Appletons' cottage in Midland, Ontario, when the homeowners arrived to check on their home. He shoved a gun in the couple's face and demanded they drive him to their home in the city. But once they arrived in Toronto, and in a busy intersection, Mr. Appleton refused to comply and told the man he wouldn't take him any further. To the couple's surprise, their abductor got out of the car in a busy downtown area of Toronto and vanished into the crowd. Based on the couple's memory, the assailant was described as a white male in his mid-30s, with unkempt hair and unkempt clothing and no accent when he spoke. While putting together their investigation, police were starting to believe the house hermit might be responsible for the murders of the Blackburns as well. They also began developing a profile of their killer. A man they suspect is a quiet, meticulous loner. Based on the crime scene, police came to the conclusion that they were dealing with someone who was methodical, very well organized, very well planned, and very structured. The human excrement wrapped in newspapers left behind, police saw as a very intense and very obsessive type of behavior. By late May of 1992, and almost 2 months after the Blackburn murder, police have yet to attach a name to any of the crimes. They decide to release some of their best evidence to the public and show samples of the detailed war game lists to the media. A woman named Allison Shaw from Orangeville would eventually come forward and identify the handwritings as belonging to David Snow, a man who was known for his unkempt appearance. Police are skeptical at first, but Shaw had worked with David in the past and is positive he is the one who wrote these bizarre lists. David was described by the locals as a bit odd and a loner. He kept pretty much to himself. He previously worked at a couple of manufacturing jobs, but his real love was buying and selling antiques. Snow turned his hobby into a career in the mid-1980s, when he began working at McKenna's auction barn. McKenna's manager, Craig Kimberly, said that Snow knew more about antiques than anyone he'd ever met. Quote, "He'd flip a table and tell you where it was from, all about it, just by looking at the type of nails. He just knew what he was looking at." In the late 1980s, Snow opened up his own antique shop called Simply Timeless Antiques. When the antique shop started to have some money issues, Snow randomly disappeared. Coincidentally, around the same time was when those strange break-and-enters in Caledon Cottage country began. Fortunately, Orangeville police already had copies of David Snow's fingerprints on file from previous run-ins with the law. After 2 days, police were able to confirm that the prints matched up. The mysterious house hermit of the Caledon area was David Alexander Snow. At this point in the investigation, there was no direct evidence linking David Snow to the murder of the Blackburns. However, on June 1st, a Canada-wide warrant was issued for his arrest in connection with the abduction of the Appletons. Police described Snow as a quiet loner who lacked confidence and suffered from mood swings. They also said he had poor hygiene, strong body odor, and rotting teeth. Within hours, detectives and forensic photographers were searching David Snow's home in Orangeville, looking for more evidence. In the attic of the home, they found a makeshift bunker he had constructed for himself that consisted of an old mattress, a frying pan, and a cord had been rung through the ceiling with a light on it. And when police searched the home, they found an unusual collection of pornography that was basically cut-out pieces of women's body parts. Also found in the home were boxes of books on the subject of war. There were books on armored trains, firearms, warships, planes. Basically anything dealing with military equipment was found in a book somewhere in that home. Also found in a collection of photographs was a picture of a barn located at the Blackburn farmhouse. At the very least, David Snow was aware of who the Blackburns were. Although police had fingerprints and the name of a possible suspect, they really didn't know much else about David or where he might be. Police knocked on doors around town, but many residents of Orangeville thought the police were wrong. They knew that David was odd, but thought that he wouldn't hurt anyone. The intense police presence in this small town also made residents nervous. All the police could really get about David Snow from the people of Orangeville was that he was odd, had bad hygiene, and sold antiques. After interviewing family members and old acquaintances, police discovered that after high school, David's father passed away. It was around this time he started becoming more reclusive. Police also asked friends and family if David would ever leave the province of Ontario. None of them thought that he would. He didn't have a driver's license, was afraid of driving, and relied on people to drive him around, or took public transportation, or hitchhiked, or walked. Which is why it was surprising that on April 8th, the day after the Blackburns were last seen alive, that David bought a train ticket to Vancouver under the fake name David Wilson. And on June 29, 1992, David Snow began his reign of terror in Vancouver. A 27-year-old woman was working alone in a store when Snow entered and told her that he wanted to buy a gift. He then asked for directions to a bank and returned a few times afterwards. She said she remembered him because of his horrible hygiene. He smelled terrible. As the woman was about to close the store for the evening, David knocked on the locked door and talked his way back inside, where he then pulled out a gun. He took the woman into the back room, tied her wrists together with twine, and took money from the cash register and her purse. He sexually assaulted her, and at one point when Snow was at the front of the store, the woman managed to unlock the back deadbolt with her hand still bound and ran away naked. She would be the first of 3 women attacked at gunpoint in the Vancouver area. Police were called and the victim was interviewed, and even though she wrote a detailed 10-page report with a clear description of Snow and his rotting teeth and stinking body odor, Vancouver police didn't find an artist to do a composite drawing until 10 days afterwards. The assault was treated as an isolated incident, and the women in the area weren't warned to stay alert. On July 3rd, just 5 days after the first attack, Snow struck again at a suitor's photo shop on Hastings Street. He entered the shop and asked for pricing for portraits. And again, he returned at closing time and pointed a gun at the 21-year-old employee. He told her that he had escaped from prison and was not going back. He then walked her out of the store and across the Second Narrows Bridge to North Vancouver. She considered trying to escape, but thought he would shoot her if her attempt failed. Once across the bridge, the woman is led another 8 kilometers before finally arriving to a wooded area near the Trans-Canada Highway. David had been there a while, and he had a campsite constructed within 75 yards of the busiest road in Vancouver. And when they reached his camp, David hogtied and gagged her. During the 8 days she was held in captivity, she was repeatedly sexually assaulted by Snow and kept tied to a tree. He even unloaded, cleaned, and reloaded 3 guns while she was forced to watch. He also purchased newspapers daily, looking for stories about himself. 8 days after the kidnapping, David headed back into Vancouver, looking for another victim. By July of 1992, 2 separate police investigations are taking place in 2 different provinces. Ontario police are still searching for a man responsible for the murder of the Blackburns. And on the other side of the country, almost 4,000 kilometers away, Vancouver police are investigating the disappearance of a young woman. Eventually, these 2 investigations would be linked together, but not before more women were victimized. On July 11, 1992, Snow abducted a 19-year-old woman from Movieland, a nearby video store. He pulled a gun on her, stole $80, and tied up the owner and the 19-year-old with a telephone wire. He made her drive back to his campsite, and then told both women he was taking them outside the city. They then drove to Indian River Road, where he tied up both of the women in the woods. The owner of the video store managed to untie himself, and the RCMP were alerted. The North Vancouver police began their search for the woman's car, a 1975 Volkswagen Beetle. In total, Snow would be hunted for 18 hours by the police. On Sunday, July 12th, David Snow, who at this point was getting desperate, ran an 8-kilometer trek from the Indian River Road area to the Bridge House restaurant on Capilano Road. He had a good reason to run. The police weren't far behind. He climbed near vertical mountain canyons, crossed rivers higher than his waist, and lost his shoes while being hunted by police. It was the largest manhunt in North Vancouver RCMP history, with more than 40 officers using infrared scanning devices, helicopters, and police dogs. 2 of the officers involved in the search were Dave Kwasnica and Reg Cardinal. They said they thought the only reason to kidnap the victim would be to sexually assault them. In order to do this, the assailant would need a secluded area, so the 2 officers began their search in secluded areas. The RCMP would eventually find the clerk's abandoned car on a wooded back road, about a 20-minute drive away from the store. The police heard screaming and found the 2 young women, but Snow eluded dozens of police searchers in the forested mountains. He would be finally captured late in the evening on Sunday, July 12th, while he was attempting to kill a restaurant employee by placing a bag over her head and strangling her with a wire. Fortunately, she had tripped the silent alarm in the restaurant, and police responded after disbelieving her phone call to cancel it. A quick-thinking alarm company dispatcher, Jeff Augustine, said that the woman called to say she would be leaving the Bridge House restaurant premises, gave her security code, and set the alarm at about 3:30 a.m. Minutes later, she called back to say she had returned to the restaurant, but a short time later, the silent alarm was triggered. He called her to check to see if everything was okay, but something didn't seem right. She answered the questions correctly and gave all of the right code words, but he still wasn't comfortable with the situation. The woman on the line sounded irritated, which was unlike her. He said she was usually pleasant to speak with. Augustine contacted the RCMP and sent a security guard to the restaurant as a precautionary measure. This was a move that would save her life. David Snow would be arrested at 4 a.m. behind the North Vancouver restaurant for the kidnapping of the 2 women and attacking a third. Police seized several guns from the car Snow used to flee the video store abduction, including some reported stolen from a break-in near Caledon in Ontario. He faced 15 charges in Vancouver, including attempted murder, 4 counts of forcible confinement, 3 counts of kidnapping, 4 armed robbery charges, sexual assault, and sexual assault with a weapon. Snow had apparently been living under bridges and on the streets in Vancouver and North Vancouver before the kidnappings. While he was in custody, Snow confided in a former jailmate that he was, quote, turned on by killing. This jailhouse informant would eventually turn on Snow and later testify at his trial. While discussing the 4 Vancouver women with the informant, Snow referred to them as his toys, and that he could do whatever he wanted to do to them, and allegedly boasted that he almost got away with it. He would go on trial for the assaults, kidnappings, and robberies, but the trial was short-lived. He would plead guilty to 10 of the charges, and the remaining charges were stayed, with the exception of the attempted murder of his last victim. This trial wouldn't conclude until September 11th of that year. In this case, Snow would be found guilty of sexual assault causing bodily harm, unlawful confinement, and using a firearm while attempting to commit an indictable offense. But unbelievably, Judge Jerome Paradis found Snow not guilty of attempted murder, and in his judgment said that just the act of placing a plastic bag over the victim's head and a wire around her neck wasn't sufficient enough to establish, quote, a specific intent to kill, and the intent was to stifle her and prevent her from seeking assistance. Seriously, this judge has no business being a judge. One police officer testified that the wire was so tight around her neck that the skin bulged around it a full 2.5 centimeters. And the medical evidence found an abnormal amount of acid in her system, a direct result of oxygen deprivation. The report said the amount was sufficient to kill her if she hadn't been found so quickly. Snow's victim, Dalia Gelano, was outraged with the verdict, to say the least. While he was serving his time in prison, Snow also allegedly confessed to other prisoners that the police were trying to build a case against him in the 2 Ontario murders, but the Toronto police weren't smart enough. Ontario police, in the meantime, were preparing to interview Snow about multiple murders and several break-ins. They were also investigating whether he was responsible for the abduction and slaying of 15-year-old Kristen French, who disappeared about a week after the Blackburns were murdered. This case, of course, would end up being the work of Paul Bernardo, who was also terrorizing the women of southern Ontario around the same time. However, while awaiting trial for the Blackburn murders, the Crown had one more unresolved issue to deal with in North Vancouver. They would be applying to the court to have David Snow declared a dangerous offender and jailed indefinitely. David Snow's victims would give victim impact statements and heartbreaking testimony about how he ruined their lives. His own brother, Victor Snow, even testified against him at this hearing. He said his brother had been a walking time bomb for years, who rejected pleas to stabilize his life and seek psychiatric help. David Snow would end up refusing to be interviewed for his court-ordered psychiatric evaluation. Instead, Dr. Elizabeth Zoffman prepared her report for the court based on victim impact statements and interviews with Snow's brothers, his sister, and former business partners. In her report, she stated that David Snow was probably acting out his bizarre and violent fantasies when he attacked the 4 women in 1992, and that David Snow has antisocial and narcissistic personality disorder. A second psychiatrist testified that Snow was a sexual sadist, and there was a high risk that he would reoffend if left untreated. I'm no doctor, but I'm pretty sure that sadists can't be treated, but that's a whole other discussion. And then, on July 23, 1993, Judge Jerome Paradis would conclude that because of Snow's deviant behavior, there was a likelihood he would commit the same offenses. Snow was declared a dangerous offender and sentenced to an indefinite period in prison. But the courts weren't through with David Snow yet. He was ordered to stand trial in 1994 in Ontario for the 1992 kidnapping of Sam and Rose Appleton, as well as robbery and break-and-enter charges. Snow would go on trial in 1997 for the murders of the Blackburns, and he would plead not guilty. The trial lasted for almost 6 months, but in the end, the evidence would be overwhelming. DNA samples from David Snow's hair and blood matched the tissue found in Nancy Blackburn's car. He would be found guilty of the Blackburns murders and sentenced to the mandatory 25 years to life to be served concurrently with his other sentences. And this was pretty much the end of the story, until the year 2019. Every prisoner in Canada, even the ones slapped with a dangerous offender designation, have the opportunity to apply for parole. So in 2019, Snow applied for parole. When asked by the parole board about being a sexual deviant, Snow replied, quote, "Well, I must be." He also said that he, quote, "derived no sexual gratification in assaulting his victims." Fortunately, his requests for day parole and full parole were denied. He apparently expressed to Corrections Canada he would like to be released to a community residential facility and participate in volunteer activities and potential part-time employment. The parole report said that Corrections Canada didn't support his request based on his low reintegration potential. As of today, David Snow is 68 years old and remains behind bars. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me today. If you enjoyed learning about this case, please be sure to like and subscribe. If there's a case you would like me to cover for a future video, let me know in the comment section down below. To support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to donate. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.